Smoke rose from the clearing before dawn broke, a thin gray thread that Nessa Vile had learned to coax from nearly nothing. She knelt beside the stone ring, forearms braced on her thighs, watching the tinder catch from the banked coals she'd pulled from yesterday's fire. 3 years of mornings had taught her the precise angle needed, the way to feed kindling without smothering flame, how to breathe without blowing too hard. The burn scar across the back of her left hand and up her forearm caught the first orange light, white tissue bright against her deep brown skin. She didn't flinch away from it anymore. The hand worked fine, better than fine. By the time full light came, she had proper wood on the fire, seasoned oak from the stack against the northern edge of camp, wood split last summer and stacked with precision. Everything in the Ashenvale clearing existed in order now, in the kind of meticulous arrangement that 3 years of solitude carved into a person like water through stone. The central fire ring marked the heart of what had once been a village of 30 souls. Now it was hers alone, and she kept it burning every night without exception. Nessa stood, her movements economical and sheer, and surveyed the circle of structures that rose like a graveyard of timber and stone. The communal hall to the east, its great doors still thrown open in some gesture of departure that had never been closed. 3 family lodges clustered to the south, their entrances dark and sealed for the winter. The smokehouse to the west, empty now of any function save the memory of hanging game. The Alpha's residence at the northern point of the circle, largest of all, stone-built and solid, its windows like blank eyes. 30 homes arranged for a pack that had walked away, leaving her behind with a broken ankle and no explanation beyond the pack leader's curt words. "We cannot wait for a broken Omega." The migration south had taken them all, to where the winters were kinder and the hunting better. To where she wasn't. The gray one emerged from the pine wood to the north as Nessa gathered her carrying frame. Asha, she called the wild she-wolf, though the creature had never acknowledged a name. The wolf moved with that familiar limp in her back right leg, her gray and white coat matted with the remnants of frost from the night. Her left ear was torn, the edge ragged from some long-ago violence that predated her presence in this clearing. She never came closer than the edge of the firelight, but she came every morning, drawn by habit or need or something Nessa couldn't name. Not friendship. The wolf was wild, feral, nothing like the trained pack mates Nessa had grown up with, but there was an understanding between them, forged in 3 winters of proximity and the simple trade of survival. Nessa kept the fire burning, and the gray one brought meat to the edge of the clearing when the snow ran deep and the hunting was thin. Today Asha carried nothing but her own weight. Her ribs showed beneath her thick coat, not starving but lean from the cold. She settled herself near the fire, far enough to avoid the heat, but close enough that Nessa could see the rise and fall of her breathing. The wolf's dark eyes tracked Nessa as she fitted the carrying frame across her shoulders and took up her hand axe. The morning's work waited, the snares in the east ravine to be checked and reset, the wood pile in the south grove to be reduced by another careful section, water to be hauled up from the frozen creek where she'd cut a hole 3 days prior. The life of one person in an abandoned camp required constant maintenance, constant forward motion. Stasis was death in places like this. Wood came first, always. The carrying frame was heavy with cordage and purpose, and Nessa moved through the camp's perimeter path with the muscle memory of endless repetition. The southern grove held her primary fuel supply, trees that had fallen in a storm 5 years past and had been slowly worked into manageable lengths. She'd become practiced at reading wood grain, at finding the fracture point that would let her split pieces without wedging the axe in vain. The hand axe bit clean into a length of birch, her shoulders rolling with the force of it, and the wood fell apart like it had been waiting all winter to yield. Another swing, another. By the time the sun crested over the mountains to the east, her frame was loaded with 8 pieces and her breath came slow and controlled, mist curling from her mouth in the still air. The journey back to camp took longer with the weight. Nessa didn't rush. Haste meant mistakes, and mistakes out here meant cold or hunger or worse. The path was marked deliberately with small stones she'd placed seasons ago. She followed them by habit now, barely conscious of the navigation. The burned leather of her boots, risoled twice with her own hands, crunched on the frozen ground. She wore layered wool beneath an oilskin coat stained with countless campfire seasons, and all of it was cold and slightly damp the way winter made everything. Her body had adjusted to this state of affairs. She couldn't remember what it felt like to be entirely warm anymore. The camp appeared through the tree line as she emerged, smoke still rising strong from the central fire. The gray one was gone, disappeared back into the forest in that silent way of hers, but her paw prints circled the perimeter of the clearing. Asha had made a complete circuit of the camp while Nessa was in the grove. This happened sometimes, the wolf checking the boundaries, marking territory, or merely existing in the space that had become theirs by default. Nessa unloaded the wood with practiced efficiency, stacking pieces against the central storage ring. 30 pieces per day, she'd calculated. 40 on days when the wind came hard and the fire needed more heat to hold its own. The calculation sustained her as much as the wood did. The snares waited until late afternoon. Nessa took her hunting knife, her fire kit in its oilskin pouch, and a length of cord, pushing into the eastern ravine where the creek cut deep through stone and overhang. The snares were her own design, modified from teaching she barely remembered, refined through trial and endless error. In 3 years, she'd learned what worked and what wasted cordage. Small game mostly, rabbits, the occasional grouse, once a fox that had nearly taken her eye before she managed to kill it with her knife. The meat in her stores came from those snares more than any grand hunting gesture. The life of a lone omega was built on persistence and small successes, not dramatic victories. 2 snares yielded nothing today. The third held a rabbit, already dead, frozen stiff, in the grip of the cord. Nessa collected it without sentiment, resetting the trap, testing the tension carefully. The rabbit would be stewed, its bones boiled for broth that would stretch through 3 days of winter eating. Nothing wasted, nothing forgotten. She worked her way back through the ravine as the light began its thin turning toward dusk, the rabbit tied at her belt, the snares checked and reset and waiting for tomorrow's circuit. Darkness came fast in winter. By the time she'd cleared the ravine, the sky had shifted to that peculiar purple that preceded true night. Nessa moved quickly but not panicked, following the creek back to where it met the meadow, then striking north toward the clearing. The fire was still visible through the trees, her ancient beacon, the thing she'd kept burning through ice storms and grief and the bone-deep isolation of 3 winters alone. She'd fed it that morning with enough wood to burn through the afternoon, and now she'd add her full evening stack, ensuring it would burn through the night. The fire was covenant. The fire was all she had left of the Ashenvale pack, and she would not let it die. The clearing opened before her, and Nessa moved into its familiar geometry with the ease of long repetition. She arranged the evening wood, built the kindling carefully into the coals that still glowed red beneath the ash. The fire responded, blooming upward, and she stood for a moment in its warmth, her hands outstretched. This was the ritual that had sustained her more than food or sleep or any of the other mechanics of survival. This daily resurrection of flame from ember and intention. This refusal to let the camp go cold. Night settled across the clearing with its particular density, the kind of darkness that came when snow lay thick on the ground and stars burned clear in a sky without moon. Nessa sat beside her fire, a simple wooden stew in a ceramic pot balanced on stones at the fire's edge. The rabbit meat had rendered its fat, and she'd added last season's dried herbs, the root vegetables she'd stored in the underground chamber. The smell was rich and vital, and she ate slowly, deliberately, aware of every taste. Winter eating was about efficiency, but she'd learned to make efficiency into something almost like pleasure. The gray one returned as the fire burned toward its deepest night colors. Asha emerged from the darkness with her characteristic silence, settling at the edge of the firelight without the hesitation of previous nights. There was something different in her bearing, something alert that set the hair on the back of Nessa's neck into a state of questioning. The wolf's head was raised, her scarred ear twisted toward the north, toward the timber that rose beyond the camp's perimeter. Nessa watched her, waiting, understanding without words that something had shifted in the balance of the clearing's small world. A sound came then, distant but unmistakable once the wolf had made her aware of it. Movement through the northern woods, heavy, deliberate, approaching. Not the careless crashing of prey animals, but the intentional passage of something large and aware. Nessa's hand went to the hilt of her knife, though she didn't draw it. 3 years she'd been alone in this clearing. 3 years without the sound of another being that walked on 2 legs, that spoke in words, that carried the complex weight of pack and intention. Her body went very still, waiting, listening to the distant sounds of approach through the frozen night. The fire burned between her and the darkness, and for the first time in 3 years, it might not be enough to keep the world at bay. The northern reaches held their breath in the failing light of winter. Cale Marden had learned to read landscapes the way others read ledgers. Angles of approach, supply lines, shelter, water. The trade roads had thinned considerably as his company pushed past the rim of civilized territory, and the villages that still clung to the maps grew fewer and farther between. His gray fur cloak, singed at the hem from campfires and campaign trails, hung heavy across his shoulders as he rode. The leather of his gloves creaked with each adjustment of the reins. Doran, his first guard, had grown increasingly tense as the afternoon deepened, though neither man had spoken of it. There was nothing here worth the Alpha King's attention. Nothing here at all. Then Cale smelled it. Smoke. Not the thin, tentative smoke of a hunting camp or a way station. This was a hearth fire, substantial and deliberate, burning with purpose. He raised his hand, and the column behind him slowed without question. Doran moved his horse level with Cale's, jaw tightening as he caught the scent a moment later. There were no settlements marked on the northern maps in this region. No villages, no outposts, no legitimate reason for a fire of that size to exist where nothing else lived. Doran's hand drifted to the hilt of his sword, old habit making a weapon of his caution. Cale studied the tree line. The smoke rose in a thin, steady plume from somewhere beyond the stand of dark pines that marked the territory's border. It was winter, and large fires meant either desperate people or dangerous ones. Raiders, perhaps, holed up in territory that belonged to no pack and therefore to all of them. Or deserters from the southern campaigns, gone to ground in the nowhere spaces between kingdoms. Cale had spent his 30 years learning that unexpected fires in border territory were rarely harbingers of good fortune. He turned to Doran and spoke quietly. "Hold the company here. Keep them at distance. I need to see this myself." Doran's expression darkened, but he knew better than to argue with the Alpha King about his own safety. The guard had positioned themselves a quarter-mile back before Cale pressed forward alone, his horse moving at a careful walk through the scattered pines. The smoke grew heavier as he approached, the scent of burning hardwood mixing with something else, something that made the wolf beneath his skin stir with attention, not threat, curiosity. As he penetrated deeper into the forest, the light grew progressively dimmer, filtered through the dense needles of the evergreens that towered on either side of his path. His horse's breath came in white plumes, and the snow beneath its hooves crunched softly, each step measured and deliberate. The forest pressed in around him with a weight that was almost palpable, a sense of vast, ancient wilderness that had been old when the kingdoms were young. Pine needles lay thick on the ground, and the air itself seemed to have gained texture, cold enough to ache in the lungs, carrying the mineral scent of snow and stone and the deeper green smell of living forest. The fire scent grew stronger the closer he came, mixing now with other smells that his wolf could identify even if his human mind hesitated to name them. Meat being smoked, leather being worked, the particular sharp scent of birch bark burning. This was not a desperate camp. This was a maintained holding. His instincts, honed by decades of command and conflict, began to reorganize their assessment of what waited ahead of him. The clearing opened before him like a held breath. Cale drew his horse to a halt at the tree line and took in the impossible. A full pack camp, laid out with the precision and care of a settlement meant to last seasons. Structures stood in orderly arrangement, a large central lodge with smoke visible through its roof vents, smaller buildings arranged in protective circles, a storehouse with smoke holes, what appeared to be a training ground, cleared of snow and marked with beaten earth. The central hearth roared with flame, tended with obvious care. This was not a temporary shelter. This was a home, meticulously maintained, built by hands that had fought with the land and won. The construction spoke of deliberate intention and long hours of labor. Even from a distance, he could see the care invested in each structure, from the precisely fitted logs to the neat arrangement of supplies stacked outside the storehouse. And in the clearing, feeding wood to the central fire, stood a single woman. Cale dismounted with deliberate slowness, giving the woman time to notice him. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he descended from his horse, each movement measured and intentional. He expected the usual responses. Fear sometimes, aggression occasionally, submission almost always. What he got was neither. The woman, dark-skinned, with her black hair cut short at her jaw, continued feeding the fire without pause. She wore practical leather and heavy wool, layered against the cold with an understanding of what the northern winter demanded. Her movements were economical, purposeful. She did not run. She did not bow. She barely acknowledged him at all, as though an Alpha King in full travel leathers and the scars of a dozen campaigns had simply decided to materialize at her campfire like smoke, and she had long ago stopped being impressed by smoke. Cale tied his horse to a post near what appeared to be a stable, well-constructed and stocked with hay. The posts themselves were sturdy oak, driven deep and set with the kind of precision that spoke of long-term planning. The woman was feeding the fire with pieces of split hardwood, each log placed with the precision of someone who had done this thousands of times. The logs themselves were uniform in size and cut, suggesting access to proper tools and the knowledge to use them. On her left hand and forearm, burn scars traced patterns across her dark skin. Old scars, intentional scars, scars that spoke of fire and survival and a long familiarity with pain. The patterns were almost ritualistic, deliberate patterns of marked flesh that suggested something far deeper than accident. Cale approached the fire pit, close enough that the heat of it pressed against his face with an almost physical force. The warmth was intense, demanding, a tangible presence that pushed back against the creeping cold of the gathering darkness. He studied the woman more closely, his eyes adjusting to the glare and shadow of the flames. The fire itself was a masterwork of maintenance, not burning chaotically, but arranged with careful precision so that the heat radiated in particular directions, so that certain areas burned hotter than others. This was the work of someone who understood fire the way an artist understood paint. She was in her mid-20s, he judged, with the kind of compact strength that came from years of work rather than training yards. Her dark brown eyes, when they finally flicked toward him, held no deference. She looked at him as she might look at a question she was not particularly interested in answering. There was something in that gaze that caused the wolf beneath Kale's skin to shift uncomfortably, caught between recognition and confusion. She smelled of smoke and old ash, of pine resin, and something wild that the human part of him could not quite name. The scent was layered. Fire, certainly. But beneath that, something feral and untamed, something that made the predator in him recognize a kindred nature. Kale waited, watching as she returned her attention entirely to the fire. A full minute passed in silence. 2. The woman worked with the absorption of someone performing an essential task, the kind of work that admitted no distractions. She adjusted logs, encouraged the flames to burn in particular directions, used an iron rod to shift coals with the precision of a surgeon adjusting instruments. The rod itself was well worn, its handle smooth from years of use. Kale realized with growing certainty that she was not going to acknowledge him at all unless forced. The Alpha King had been called many things in his 30 years. Formidable, dangerous, ruthless. He had very rarely been ignored. He found himself asking the question in the tone of someone who had no need to demand answers. Why is one woman maintaining a pack camp built for 30? The woman did not respond immediately. She fed another log to the fire, adjusted the angle of the flames with practiced efficiency, and finally spoke without turning. The camp maintains itself. I tend the fire. It is a simple arrangement. Her voice was quiet and even, with the kind of rasp that came from disuse. She might not have spoken to another person in some time. Kale moved to the logs, stacked near the fire pit, and settled himself on one, close enough to feel the heat, but not so close that he invaded the space she had marked as her own. The woman stiffened almost imperceptibly, the only sign of surprise she had given since his arrival. The Alpha King did not sit at fires. The Alpha King issued commands and received obedience. The Alpha King did not wait. But Kale had spent enough years reading the silences between words to recognize that this woman would not answer his questions through force of will or rank. She would answer only on her own terms, and only if she decided he was worth the effort. The fire crackled between them, releasing sparks that rose into the darkening air like embers seeking the stars that were beginning to emerge overhead. The heat shimmered invisible waves, creating distortion around the fire pit. Snow lay thick around the clearing's edge, untouched and pristine, while the area immediately surrounding the fire had been packed hard by countless passages of careful feet. Behind the campfire, the dark line of the forest pressed against the clearing like a living thing, ancient and patient. In the distance, barely visible in the gathering dusk, stood the northern mountains, their peaks white with snow that would not begin to thaw for months yet. The air was so cold it burned in the lungs. Somewhere in the forest, a creature moved through the undergrowth, too heavy for a common animal, too quiet for a human. Perhaps a bear in its winter den, disturbed by the presence of strangers. The woman did not react. She was entirely focused on the fire, on the precise arrangement of burning logs, on the maintenance of the flame that kept the darkness at bay. Kale watched the woman work. He had been trained from birth to read people the way scholars read books, to find the story in scars and stance, and the particular way someone held their shoulders. This woman's story was written in her body. The burn scars suggested experience with fire so prolonged that it had become part of her skin, part of her identity. The practiced efficiency of her movements suggested years of isolated work, the kind of labor that built competence through repetition and loneliness. The way she moved through the camp, careful and economical, suggested someone who had learned not to waste energy on unnecessary motion. She had been here a long time. Years, Kale realized with something like understanding. She had been here for years, perhaps since before the wars that had drawn his attention northward, perhaps for longer than that. In the sky above, the last light of day was draining away toward the horizon, leaving behind the deep purples and grays of approaching night. The stars were beginning to emerge, sharp and cold and indifferent to the warmth of the central hearth. The contrast was striking, the heat of the fire against the encroaching cold, the light against the gathering darkness, the ordered space of the clearing against the wild press of the forest beyond. Kale remained sitting on the log, watching the woman tend her fire, asking no more questions. The Alpha King had learned patience a long time ago. He could wait for answers. He could sit in silence with someone else's story and allow it to unfold at its own pace. The woman continued her work, neither dismissing him nor acknowledging his presence. In the gathering darkness, surrounded by a camp built for many and maintained by one, they sat together in the particular kind of silence that precedes something neither of them could yet name. The The fire burned between them, steady and sure, and the northern wilderness pressed close around them both. The night deepened, and still neither spoke. Cale did not leave at dawn. He remained through the second night with the same deliberate stillness that had marked his arrival. The fire burned between them, fed by wood. Nessa brought from the lean-to where she stored branches, sorted by dryness and burn time. She moved around him as though he were stone, neither welcoming nor openly objecting to his presence. By the third morning, when she returned from the snare lines with a caught rabbit, she had stopped waiting for him to declare his purpose. A message went back to Doran through one of the younger guards, delivered quietly at the tree line. The Alpha King would remain at the camp. Resources would not be withdrawn. The Chief Marshal received the news without visible reaction, simply repositioned the perimeter guard and settled into the waiting that had become his habit. In a kingdom where the Alpha King's movements were tracked and measured, noted by rivals and counselors alike, this decision required no explanation. Doran had learned long ago not to question choices made at the edge of Cale's authority. On the second full day, Nessa spoke. Her voice came in fragments, broken by long silences, as though language itself had become a foreign thing that needed careful reconstruction. She sat across from him, with the rabbit dressed and strung on a spit, the small flames licking upward with hungry tongues. Her hands moved in the work of tending meat while she spoke, as if the movement gave her words permission to exist. They left 3 years into the dry season. She offered this without preamble, without context. Kyle waited. A pack does not abandon their own without reason. And whatever truth lived in this camp, it would arrive in its own time. The ankle broke on a hunt. She was young, reckless, with the kind of fearlessness that only youth permits. A fall from a ridge that should have killed her, and she should have been grateful for the bones that held together well enough for healing. But the pack healer was newly bonded to the Silver Reach territory to the north. The next nearest was 2 days' travel. The injury meant she could not keep pace, could not hunt, could not run with them. A burden, even a temporary one, shifts the weight of everything. She told him this while watching the fire burn. The scar on her left hand caught the light as she adjusted the spit. Cale noticed how deliberately she kept that hand visible, how she did not hide it even when the orange glow made it seem to pulse like a living thing. They decided to wait, she said. The pack decided. They would return to the camp after the season hunt and retrieve her, gather her when she was whole again. It made sense. Packs hunted together or not at all, and her weight was dead weight. So she remained with enough provisions for a month, instructions to maintain the fires, and the absolute certainty that they would return. They did not return. By the time she realized the truth, winter had already come. The provisions were gone. The fires, which were meant to be comfort and signal, became survival. She learned which trees burn longest, how to judge the moisture in wood by weight and sound. She learned to read the smoke, to keep the flames at a height that drew attention without drawing the wrong kind of attention. She built the lean-to from fallen branches and bark, constructed snares from sinew and sapling, found the smoking rack already standing behind the old camp lodge and cleaned it for use. She could have let the fires die, Nessa said. Could have simply let them go cold and accepted the truth in that extinguishing. Could have decided to follow whatever trail the pack had left behind. But letting those fires die felt like agreeing with them. It felt like saying, yes, you were right to leave me. You were right that I was expendable. And she would not give them that, even in their absence, especially in their absence. She would not give them that satisfaction. Cale understood then, with a clarity that felt like ice entering his veins, that he had been watching a woman keep an entire rebellion burning in a camp of ghosts. On the third day, she showed him her world. The snare lines ran in 3 directions from the camp, placed where the deer trails bent toward water. She moved through them with the kind of practiced ease that spoke to thousands of repetitions, tiny adjustments made season after season. Here, the trigger was too loose after winter's frost. The binding needed replacing. Here, the approach had become overgrown with new growth, and the snare would need moving 5 paces north. She showed him the smoking rack, where fish hung in stages of drying, silver-skinned and hard as wood, each one representing a meal secured. The water run had been diverted 3 winters ago, when the original stream bed flooded too close to camp. Now a system of channels and careful banking kept it flowing where she needed it. She read weather from the tree canopy, the way scholars read text. The way certain leaves curled meant a storm system was rolling down from the northern passes. The height at which birds nested told her how early the warm season would break. A particular fungus on the northern face of the oldest oak meant the humidity would rise for a week, and she adjusted her smoking fires accordingly. 3 years of isolation had made her fluent in a language most wolves never bothered to learn, a dialect written in seasons and growth and the patient rotation of the natural world. Cale watched her move through the space she had carved out of abandonment, and something shifted in the way he perceived her. This was not a broken Omega who had been left behind. This was not a woman waiting to be rescued, sitting among the ashes of what had been and praying for what might return. Nessa Vile had taken the raw materials of her own desolation and built something that required constant attention and unwavering will to maintain. She had chosen every single day for 3 years to remain. On the third night, the wild wolf came. She arrived as she always did, at the edge of the firelight where the darkness remained absolute. Asha was large for a she-wolf, her fur a gray and white tapestry of scars and seasons. She did not approach Cale. Instead, she moved to Nessa with the kind of easy intimacy that spoke to years of understanding. The Omega raised her burned hand, and the wolf pressed her enormous head against it, exhaling warm breath that fogged slightly in the cooling air. Cale watched the exchange without moving, without even shifting his gaze. He understood what he was seeing. This was not a feral creature passing through. This was a bond that had formed in the spaces between loneliness and necessity. Two creatures who had found in each other the kind of companionship that required no words and tolerated no pretense. The wild wolf was Nessa's family now, had been for some time, perhaps longer than she had expected, longer than she had planned. But there in the darkness, with Asha's head resting against her burned hand, Nessa looked less alone than she had any right to look. The Alpha King saw in that moment something that very few in his kingdom had ever permitted themselves to acknowledge. That an Omega could stand at the center of her own story and never once require a pack to make that story whole. Cale did not sleep that night. He remained awake through the hours when the fire burned lowest, watching the smoke rise in delicate columns toward stars that had seen 3 years of this woman's solitude. He thought about the choices that led to abandonment, about the packs that decided their weakest member was expendable, about the kingdoms that built themselves on hierarchies that could not account for someone like Nessa Vielle. Someone who took her broken parts and fed them to a fire and kept that fire burning while the world moved on without her. On the 4th morning, Doran arrived at the camp edge. The chief marshal emerged from the tree line with 3 of the guard and the kind of careful approach that suggested his news was neither urgent nor pleasant. Cale recognized the angle of Doran's shoulders, the particular set of his scarred face. Something had shifted. Something that required the Alpha King's attention and could not be handled through the network of riders and messengers that kept the kingdom stitched together across vast distances. Nessa had retreated to the lean-to when the guard was spotted, moving with the quiet instinct of someone who had learned that strangers meant disruption. The fire burned between Cale and the approaching men, a wall of heat and light that was both beautiful and final. The Alpha King rose to his feet as Doran stepped forward. Behind them both, the camp that Nessa Vielle had built waited in the morning mist, a place she had chosen to keep burning when every reasonable choice suggested she should have let it go dark forever. Around the 3 of them, the forest held its breath. Whatever came next, whatever news Doran carried in the set of his jaw and the urgency of his arrival, something in this small camp had already been fundamentally altered. The Alpha King had come to the fire and remained there long enough to understand what was burning. There would be no returning to the world as it had existed before the smoke rose and caught his attention. The day was young. The fire was constant. And somewhere in the lean-to, a woman who had learned to be alone was beginning to understand what it meant to no longer be unseen. The news had traveled the settlement roads like smoke on wind. The Alpha King himself had been found in the northern timber. Not raiding, not hunting, staying. The stories grew larger with each telling. He had found an Omega, they said. A lone Omega in the deep wilderness holding fast to some forgotten camp. The word spread through Brindlemark, through Daleshire, through the smaller outposts where traders gathered and hunters traded coin for information. An Alpha King, dormant in the north. An Omega who had been there long enough to know the burning of her own fire. Doran Vale heard it in the barracks and let the knowledge settle in him like ash. He said nothing to Nessa. There was nothing kind in speaking it aloud. The idea that their isolation was no longer their own. that the wider world had begun to assemble a story about a woman who had asked for nothing but survival. Doran had learned long ago that the world's stories were rarely merciful. He had built a life in silence precisely because he understood that the world's version of events rarely matched the truth of what had been lived and endured. To speak of Nessa's abandonment aloud would be to make it public currency, a tale that could be shaped and reshaped by voices that had never known the true weight of what she had survived. It was on the fourth day, when the snow had begun its slow dissolve into slush, that the rider came up the forest road. He was a broad man, shoulders rounded, not from age but from years bent over a forge. His beard was thick and red gold, the kind of color that had faded from bright to something more like rust. He moved with the careful caution of someone who had been traveling through dangerous country, and his horse was fine, not wealthy, but well kept, which meant the man had risen from something into something else. He wore the smith's dust still, ground into the creases of his work-darkened hands. His clothing was marked with travel, the kind of persistent dust that comes from days on the road, and his eyes held the particular exhaustion of someone on a journey of confession rather than commerce. Doran saw him first, emerging from the tree line like a man returning to something he had never quite left. The chief marshal's hand went to his horse's neck, and he leaned slightly forward, the way one does when a ghost takes shape in daylight. There was no mistaking the bearing of him, the particular set of the shoulders that came from both smithcraft and the heritage of alphas running deep through the bloodline. Doran's jaw tightened, and he made a decision in that moment to say nothing until Nessa had seen what the forest had delivered to her door. Cale Marden was with Nessa in the upper clearing when word reached them. She had been teaching him the precise angle required to properly split cedar for roofing, a skill learned in the years alone, a skill that meant warmth and shelter held their shape. Her hands moved with such certainty that it seemed impossible she had ever been uncertain about anything. The Alpha King watched her, not the wood. There was something in the way she explained the grain of the wood, the way her fingers traced the lines invisible to eyes untrained by survival, that spoke to a deeper truth. She had learned to read the world the way others read texts. Every mark on bark and stone, every subtle shift in shadow and light, carried meaning. When Doran came to fetch them, his face wore the expression of a man bearing a thing that could not be softened by the manner of its delivery. Cale knew that expression from their weeks together. It meant the external world had breached their sanctuary. It meant the careful balance they had maintained against the wider territory had been disrupted. Nessa straightened. The knife she had been using found its place in her belt with the ease of long habit. She did not ask who. Somehow she already knew that the forest had brought her something she did not want, that the world had finally found its way to her door in the shape of memory. Her body had gone very still, the way animals go still when they sense a predator, though whether the predator was external or internal, even Cale could not determine. They came down from the clearing in silence. Thomas Burke stood by the fire pit, and Nessa's vision narrowed to the space he occupied. She had not seen him in 3 years. She had worked hard at not thinking of him in those years, but seeing him broke that work open like kindling. He was thicker through the chest than she remembered, his shoulders broader. The work of the forge had changed him into something harder, had carved away some of the youth that once lived in his features. His face, though, his face was the same, and that was the cruelty of it. The familiar lines around his mouth, the particular set of his jaw that she had once traced with her fingers in the dark, the small scar above his left eyebrow where he had split it falling from a horse years before, back when they were all young enough to think time would keep them together, back when abandonment seemed an impossible concept because the bonds of the pack felt eternal. He looked at her and something flickered across his expression, relief perhaps, or fear. Possibly both. There was also something else, a taking in of her, a reassessment of what 3 years of solitude and survival had done to the woman he remembered. Nessa could see the moment recognition moved through him. This was not the same person he had ridden away from. The fire had changed her as much as it had sustained her. Nessa came to stand across the fire pit from him. The flames moved between them, orange and restless, a living barrier that neither seemed willing to cross. Cale understood then that this was deliberate, this maintenance of distance, this choice to let the fire stand as witness and boundary both. The silence held for a long moment. It was not the silence of two people with much to say, and no words for it. It was the silence of two people who understood that words were a kind of death, because once spoken, the shape of what had happened could no longer be denied. The silence was also something else. It was the silence of accounting, of the moment before confession when both parties understood that truth-telling would alter everything that came after. Thomas broke it, as the guilty do, speaking into the space between them as though his confession could bridge it. He said that he had wanted to come sooner. He said that the pack alpha had made the decision for the winter routes, that they would close the northern passages, that no one could survive in the timber if they were left behind. His voice carried the flatness of a story he had rehearsed, the cadence of explanation worn smooth by repetition. He said that he had spoken against it, but not loudly. He said that the storm was coming and they had to ride, and by the time they had ridden far enough to know the weight of what they had done, there was no turning back. He said, "I looked back, Nessa." She waited. The fire crackled between them, and in that crackle was the sound of 3 years condensed into a single moment. He said, "I saw you sleeping by the fire. One more night before we left. I remember your scar catching the light. I remember thinking we were making a mistake, and I remember thinking that I could not be the one to change the Alpha's mind. I remember walking my horse away from you, and I remember that no one spoke against it again." The words came now with a kind of desperate velocity, as though speaking them quickly might somehow diminish their weight. His hands had begun to move, the habitual gestures of a smith trying to shape something intangible with the tools of language. The fire crackled. Small sparks rose and vanished into the cold air. Nessa did not move. She simply stood in the gathering dusk, watching the flames work between them, and in her stillness was a kind of judgment, not of anger, but of reckoning. Nessa's voice, when she spoke, was steady as the land beneath them. She said that she had kept the fire burning. She said that on the nights when she thought her strength would break, she had kept it burning. She said that she had carved the days into the stone by her campfire, that she had learned to split wood and set snares and know the plants that could keep her alive when the frozen darkness came down. There was no bitterness in her voice, or if there was, it had been tempered into something harder and more permanent. Not the raw wound of betrayal, but the scarred tissue that forms over time. She said, "Look at it now. Look at my fire, Thomas Burke. You can see it from here. Now you know what you left behind." It was not forgiveness. It was not rage. It was the simple articulation of loss, the understanding that some things once broken cannot be reformed, even if the person who broke them travels north through winter to lay their guilt at the feet of the person they have wronged. In her words was the terrible clarity of survival, the knowledge that she had endured not despite his abandonment, but perhaps because of it. She had been forged by the fire she had kept, and no apology could unmake that truth. Tomas stood for a long moment, looking at the steady flames, his hands opened and closed at his sides, the reflexive gesture of a man who had spent years shaping metal and now found himself unable to shape anything at all. He was a smith without clay, a craftsman rendered helpless before a creation that had shaped itself. The understanding seemed to move through him like a slow poison. His journey north had been made in the belief that he could restore something he had broken, but the thing he had broken had instead become whole in the breaking. He left before the sun turned full toward evening. He rode south with the weight of what he had witnessed, and Doran walked him to the tree line, as though seeing him safely away from the clearing. He rode south with the knowledge that the Omega he had abandoned was not broken, but forged, that survival had been her crucible, not her ending, that she did not need his apologies to survive what his silence had permitted. The road behind him seemed to stretch into eternity, and in that stretching was the full measure of what distance truly meant. Not merely the space between 2 points, but the chasm of choice that could never be unmade. Cale Martin watched him go, and in watching him go, understood the full architecture of Nessa's abandonment. It was not betrayal of the dramatic kind. There were no villains in this story, or all of them were equally guilty of the small cruelties that accumulate into survival, into heartbreak, into the decision to keep walking when walking meant leaving someone behind. The pack alpha had made a choice. Thomas had not fought it, and in not fighting it, he had made the choice his own. The others had done the same. No one person was monstrous. The monstrosity was distributed, was ordinary, was the quiet mechanics of how packs function when faced with the hard choice between self-preservation and loyalty. He looked at Nessa now, at the way she stood watching the fire burn as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The Alpha King understood now that he had come north to this clearing, expecting to find a woman in need of rescue, a wounded thing that his presence could repair. He was beginning to understand that this was his mistake. Nessa did not require his rescue. She required recognition, the simple acknowledgement that what she had endured had not diminished her, but had instead revealed the measure of her strength. In her fire was a signal not of desperation but of declaration, a statement made nightly to the darkness that she was still here, still burning, still alive. The fire burned steadily between them, kept alive by the hands of a woman who had asked no one for help and had received none. The smoke rose into the darkening sky, a signal that had been burning for 3 years, waiting for someone with the understanding to see it not as a plea, but as a declaration. I am here, it said. I am still burning. I have not been extinguished. Cale stood beside her in the gathering cold and began at last to comprehend what it meant to meet someone who had already saved herself. The darkness gathered around them, and in that darkness was not the absence of light, but the presence of something that had been tested and had not broken. The fire burned between them and the retreating rider, a barrier and a beacon both, and in its warmth was the answer to the question no one had thought to ask. What does it mean to survive when no one is watching, when no one expects you to, when the only witness to your endurance is the night itself? The cottage was different after Thomas left. Not changed in any physical sense, but the air felt thinner, as if confession required payment in oxygen. Nessa moved through the space as she always did, checking the fire, sorting the herbs that hung in dried bundles from the low ceiling, measuring out grain for the animals. The rhythm of survival did not pause for emotional upheaval. It never had. Cale watched from the threshold where he remained, neither fully inside nor committed to leaving. He had not moved since Thomas disappeared into the trees. And Nessa had not asked him to. There was no pity in his eyes. She had learned quickly that this was not a man who trafficked in pity. It was not kindness, exactly, but something closer to respect. The kind offered between two people who understood that sympathy was a luxury neither could afford. She finished with the fire and turned to face him directly. There was no point in pretending not to notice him. The silence between them had weight, but it was not the suffocating weight of judgment. It was simply the weight of presence. You want something, she said. Not an offer, not a question, a statement of fact. Cale moved from the threshold then, stepping into the cottage proper. He was too tall for the space, his shoulders nearly brushing the support beam that ran across the center of the room. He did not seem to notice or care. Show me how you do it, he said. Not why, not what it costs you. How? Nessa considered this. Most people who came to her wanting answers wanted explanations that would make them feel better about themselves. Validation that the world was fair, that suffering meant something, that her isolation was either noble or temporary. Cale was asking something different. He was asking her to explain the mechanics of survival, as if survival were an art she had mastered, as if the question itself was not an insult. She collected her heavy cloak from the wooden peg beside the door and gestured for him to follow. They moved out into the forest as the afternoon light began its slow descent toward dusk. The snow was lighter here, patchy beneath the thick coverage of evergreens, and the forest floor was soft with accumulated needles and the rot of 100 seasons. This was where Nessa lived as much as she lived in the cottage. Here, she said, stopping at the base of a massive spruce. She ran her hand along the bark, which was rough and fibrous beneath her fingers. The bark beetle burrows run deep this year. The spring will be harder than usual. The tree is stressed. When I need wood, I take from the northern stand where the trees are younger and more resilient. The old ones feed the forest, and the forest feeds me. Cale examined the tree with his own eyes, tracing the patterns of the bark as she had done. She watched him. He was not pretending to understand. He was actually trying. They walked deeper into the forest, and she showed him the water sources that did not freeze, explained how temperature and movement and minerals in the soil created pockets of liquid throughout the winter. She showed him the snares she maintained, set with a logic that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with understanding the paths of prey, their desperation, their hunger. She showed him the cache of berries she had collected in autumn and buried in sealed ceramic vessels beneath the snow, the exact depths and temperatures required to keep them edible for months. This is not magic, she told him, as they stood in a small clearing. This is reading. The forest speaks if you listen long enough. It tells you what it needs and what it can give. Most people are too loud to hear it. They emerged from the densest part of the forest as twilight began to blur the edges of the world. The sky had turned from blue to purple to a deep amber that seemed to emanate from within the trees themselves. Asha was waiting where they had left her, the she-wolf positioned on a higher ridge with a perfect view of the approaches to Nessa's sanctuary. The wolf's gray and white coat seemed to absorb and hold the last light of the day. She does not trust you, Nessa said. But she is not attacking. You should consider yourself fortunate. Cale did not look away from the wolf. There was no fear in him, but there was caution. recognition of something wild that could not be negotiated with or commanded. Nessa recognized this as the mark of someone who had faced truly dangerous things and lived. "How long?" he asked. Nessa did not pretend to misunderstand. "It will be another 4 months before the fire can safely be left untended. The forest is sleeping. I am the only thing keeping it warm until it remembers how to wake itself." Kale was quiet for a long time. The amber light faded to deep blue, and the stars began to emerge, small and piercing in the clear sky. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a different weight than it had before. Over the following days, Nessa found that Kale's presence had integrated itself into the rhythms of the cottage and the forest in ways she had not expected. He did not make himself useful in the way most strong men did, by forcing himself into jobs that did not need doing. Instead, he simply existed within the space and watched. He watched how she split wood, noting the angle of the blade and the weight distribution. He watched how she spoke to Asha, the subtle shifts in tone that meant safety or caution. He watched how she read the weather and the quality of light, the movement of birds, the pressure of the wind. One evening, as they sat near the fire, he told her about his kingdom. "The borders hold because people believe they will hold," he said. "But belief is fragile. We have reports of movement in the northern passes, traders going missing on the winter roads, supplies arriving damaged. I cannot determine from my palace whether these are coincidences or the first fractures in something larger. So I walk the borders myself." Nessa listened the way she listened to everything, with absolute attention and no wasted reaction. She did not offer sympathy or solutions. She simply received the information as if it were important, because to him, it was. "My generals prefer I remain where they can see me," Kale continued. "In the city, I am a symbol, strong, visible, untouchable. But in the city, I am blind. Out here, I can see what people try to hide from their king. I can hear the anxiety in merchant voices. I can feel the true state of things." "You are looking for truth," Nessa said. "Most rulers are not." Kale turned to face her. His scar caught the firelight, seeming to shift and deepen. The difference between a good kingdom and a dead one is the willingness to know the worst about yourself before your enemies do. He was quiet for another long moment, and then he spoke again. "I have been thinking about what Thomas said, about what you carry. A burden like that in a place like this." He paused, waiting for her to react with some defensive anger. She did not. "Your kingdom needs people like you, not people looking for rescue, not people waiting to be saved. The kingdom needs people who know how to keep something burning when everything logical says to let it die." Nessa rose from where she sat and added wood to the fire. The flames swallowed the new fuel eagerly, and heat pulsed outward through the cottage. She did not respond to his statement, because it was not really a question, and it was not an accident that he was speaking it now. "Come with me," Kale said. "Not as a mate, not for your future, for the kingdom's present. We need people who understand what it means to survive against every rational argument for surrender." Nessa turned from the fire to look at him directly. The light caught her burn scar, and it gleamed like something precious and hard-won. She shook her head. "The fire is still burning," she said. "I cannot leave it." Kale did not rage or argue. He did not try to convince her that she was wrong, that her sacrifice was pointless, that she should want something more. He simply accepted the refusal the way he had accepted everything else about her, as a fact of the landscape that could not be changed, only navigated around. But he did not leave either. He remained in the cottage through the remainder of the week, and when the week ended, he did not pack or gather his things or take his leave. Instead, he moved with increasing naturalness through the tasks of survival. He learned where the water sources were and brought it without being asked. He repaired the stable without commentary. He sat beside the fire and did not demand conversation or entertainment. He simply existed in the space with her, two people carrying weight they had not chosen, both refusing to set it down. One night, as snow began to fall again beyond the thick wooden walls, he spoke to her about succession, the line of command that would follow him if he died on one of these northern walks, the nephew who was intelligent but indecisive, the sister who had the temperament for leadership but no legal claim to the throne, the weight of an entire kingdom resting on the decisions of a man who could not stop walking the borders because the moment he stopped, the borders would begin to fail. Nessa listened and did not tell him that his burden was too heavy. She simply listened the way the forest listened, with full presence and no judgment. In the mornings, they would walk together into the snow, and she would show him things he had not learned in his palace: how to read the frost patterns to predict the weather, how to move through deep snow without exhausting yourself, how to exist in a space without fighting it. how to take what was offered and refuse what was demanded, how to keep something burning when the entire world was frozen. By the time the snow began to lighten and the earliest signs of spring pressed through the white, something had shifted between them. It was not love, not yet, but it was recognition. A deep knowing that another person had seen you in your worst form and had not looked away, that they had understood, not despite your refusal to be rescued, but because of it, that you were not broken, people needing to be fixed, but two people who had learned to live in the spaces between survival and surrender. And still, Cale did not leave. The fire still burned, the forest was still sleeping, and in the cottage at the edge of the world, an Alpha King sat with an Omega who had never needed him, and waited to see what kind of kingdom could be built from that fundamental truth. The snow would melt, spring would come, but something had already changed in the space where they sat, something that no amount of duty or kingdom or distant throne could convince either of them to abandon. Not yet, not soon. But eventually the fire that Nessa kept burning would need two people to tend it. For now it was enough to sit in the heat of it and know that someone else could see it too. The morning came pale and gray, the sky stripped of all warmth. Cale stood at the edge of the clearing, while his guard made final preparations for the journey south. He had not touched the warmth of the hearth since before dawn, when he had risen and dressed in layers of leather and steel, transforming back into the Alpha King that the kingdom required. The man who had sat across from Nessa by firelight seemed to dissolve with each piece of armor he fastened. That was the way of such things. The wolf came first. The duty came second. The heart was a distant third. Nessa had not slept. She had watched him dress in the darkness, knowing what the armor meant, understanding that the reprieve was ending. There was no anger in her watching. There was only a deep, resigned recognition of how things moved in the world, towards their obligations, their proper places, the roads that destiny had drawn for them before either of them was born. She had felt this before, in the nights after the pack departed, in the long winters when no one came, in the slow erosion of hope that paradoxically had kept her tending the fire with ever greater urgency, as if the more devotion she poured into the flames, the more real the possibility of their return might become. He came to her as the light was breaking through the trees. She stood near the hearth, where the fire had burned continuously for 3 years, 3 years of kindling and ash and vigilance, 3 years of a flame kept alive through bitter winters and smoke-thick summers, 3 years of maintaining something that no one was coming back to see. Her hands bore the marks of it, the pale scars where sparks had caught her, the calluses from constantly moving wood and tending coals, the permanent smell of smoke that had woven itself into her skin and hair. Cale stopped a few paces from her. There was nothing left to bargain with, no negotiation to be made. The kingdom had called him back through his guard, through the messages that had come on dark horses. The throne could not sit empty. The borders could not go undefended. The pack that depended on him could not wait for the Alpha King to finish tending to a private wound that was finally, at last, beginning to heal. She understood this. She had always understood it. Even as he sat by the fire with her, some part of her had known this moment was coming. He did not ask her again. There was no question in his voice, no space left for denial or refusal. Instead, he spoke as kings speak, with absolute certainty, as though he were simply stating a fact of the world that had always been true and would always remain so. He told her that wherever she was, there was a place waiting, not a title, not a debt, not a bond written in blood or law, simply recognition that she existed, that she had kept something burning in the dark, that if she ever chose to walk south, toward the smoke of the kingdom and the light of a proper home, there would be a space held for her, not because she had to fill it, but because it had always, secretly, belonged to her. Then he left. The guard moved efficiently through the clearing, taking up the road that led back toward civilization and stone walls and duty. Cale did not look back. Omega wolves knew not to expect that final glance. It would only make the leaving harder. It would only seed hope where hope had no business growing. He kept his eyes forward and his pace steady, and within moments the trees had swallowed him and his men. The sound of horses faded. The cracking of branches ceased. The clearing fell back into the profound silence it had known for 3 years. Only now the silence felt different. It felt final. Nessa was alone. The hearth still burned. The fire crackled and shifted, the same as it always had. The same rhythm of consumption and renewal. The same thin smoke rising toward a sky that had never asked for it. 3 years of feeding this flame. 3 years of waking in the dark and tending it. 3 years of keeping alive something that had become less about hope and more about the terrible, binding fear of what would happen if she let it die. She moved through the morning and into the afternoon in a kind of necessary numbness. She gathered wood. She maintained the flames. She performed the rituals of fire-keeping with the automaticity of ritual itself, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind sat somewhere else entirely, watching from a great distance. The fire would live another day, and another, and another, stretching endlessly into a future she could no longer imagine inhabiting. Letting the fire die meant accepting it, accepting that they were gone, that the pack had chosen a different future, that the Alpha's bond could be broken without breaking him, that she had been left behind not by accident, not by malice, but by simple, undeniable fact. She had never mattered enough to carry with them. Somewhere in the 3 years of tending the flames, this knowledge had calcified into something that felt like truth, and she had been feeding the fire partly to disprove it and partly because she could not face the alternative, the knowledge that she was exactly as important as her abandonment suggested she was. She sat beside the fire that evening. Asha appeared as the light was failing, the way she always did. The wild wolf moved through the trees with the limping grace of a creature too scarred to ever be whole, but too stubborn to ever truly break. She did not come close. Asha had learned long ago that closeness was not safe. She settled at the far edge of the firelight, a shadow within the shadows, a presence that asked nothing and gave nothing in return except the simple fact of her company. Nessa looked at the flames. They rose and fell in patterns that her mind knew by heart. Each log as it burned, each shift of the ash, each way the light pooled and retreated across the small clearing that had been her entire world. The fire had been a comfort in the loneliness. It had also been an anchor. It had been the thing she maintained, because if she stopped maintaining it, she would have to admit that maintaining it had been pointless. That 3 years of devotion to ash and ember had been an elaborate, exhausting way of running from the truth. And perhaps worse than that, it would mean admitting that she had been wrong all along, that waiting was not noble, that loyalty to something that no longer existed was not virtue, it was paralysis. The evening deepened. The fire's light grew more distinct in the gathering dark, more vivid and urgent, as though the flames themselves knew their end was approaching and burned brighter in protest. Nessa watched the logs shift and settle. She could have reached for the kindling. Her fingers twitched toward it, the habit of 3 years driving her body toward action even as her mind pulled in the opposite direction. Not yet, she whispered to herself. Not yet. But she knew, with the certainty that comes only from the deepest places inside, that the time had come. Not tomorrow, not after one more night. Now. She watched the flames, and then, in the deep darkness of evening, as the fire began its natural descent toward ash, Nessa did something she had never done in 3 years. She did not reach for the kindling. She did not build the flames higher. She did not fight the inevitable conclusion of the day. Instead, she let the fire die. It was harder than any physical pain. It was harder than the burn scars on her hand, which had faded to pale lines over the years. It was harder than any abandonment because this time the abandonment was her own choice. She was choosing to let go. She was choosing to accept that the fire had never been meant to burn forever. It had been meant to burn while she needed it, and she did not need it anymore. The recognition of this sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and irreversible. She was releasing something, and in releasing it, she was releasing herself. The flames guttered lower, the logs broke into coals, the coals turned gray and soft, and then simply ceased to exist as fire. The warmth retreated from her skin. The light faded from the clearing, leaving only the pale luminescence of dying embers. The smoke that had risen faithfully into the sky every single day for 3 years finally stopped. The clearing became dark. The silence that filled it was not the silence of waiting. It was the silence of completion. Asha remained at the edge of the dying light, watching her with ancient, knowing eyes. The wild wolf did not move. She did not comfort. She did not judge. She simply witnessed, the way that only truly broken things can witness, with complete understanding. 2 creatures, neither of them whole, watching something end together. When the last ember had cooled to darkness, Nessa rose and walked to the small shelter where she kept her few possessions. She did not pack everything. She did not take the water skins she had carefully tended. She did not take the dried provisions that represented every day of survival in the dark. She took only what she could carry, only what mattered: the knife, the cloak, the small leather journal where she had written, in careful script, everything she had wanted to say to a pack that had forgotten how to listen. She left the journal on the cold hearth. In the morning, the stone was cold for the first time in 3 years. The air of the clearing felt different without the smoke. It moved differently. The birds sang louder. The silence was not the silence of a place waiting for something. It was the silence of a place released. And in that release, something had changed in Nessa as well, as she could feel it in the lightness of her chest, in the way her breath came easier. She had spent 3 years holding something. Now, finally, she had set it down. The cold hearth seemed smaller somehow. The stone that had been the center of her world for so long was just stone now, just gray rock with ash scattered across its surface. The shelter behind her, which she had maintained with such care, already looked abandoned, as though the moment she turned away from it, the forest would begin reclaiming it. Nature was patient but thorough. Within a year, perhaps 2, the trees would grow back through the clearing. The shelter would collapse. The carefully stacked stones of the hearth would scatter. The fire would be forgotten. She stood at the edge of the clearing one final time, looking back at the camp, at the shelter with its carefully tended walls, at the stone where the fire had burned and burned and burned, at the place where the Alpha King had sat, and for just a few nights the world had felt different. She remembered his words, not as a promise, not as a debt, but as an acknowledgement, recognition, a door that had been left open if she ever wanted to walk through it. She turned toward the south, toward the smoke that meant people and warmth and the possibility of something beyond survival, toward the road that led away from the dark forest and into whatever came next. The path was visible in the pale morning light, worn and clear, a thin line of possibility stretching through the trees. She walked. Asha followed behind at a distance, the way she always had. The wild wolf did not come close enough to travel together. They were not a pack. They would never be a pack. But the wolf had watched this woman tend a fire for 3 years, and perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was its own kind of bond. The wolf followed at the edge of the tree line, a shadow at her shoulder, a witness to the choice. The road stretched ahead through the forest, growing wider as it descended. The kingdom lay somewhere beyond the trees, smoke rising from its chimneys, life moving through its streets. Nessa did not know what waited for her there. She did not know if Kale would keep his word, or if one night of warmth was all she should expect from an Alpha King who had already given her more than he owed. But something had changed in her as she watched the fire die. The future, whatever it held, was no longer written in ash and coal. It was not dependent on anyone else's return or recognition. It existed because she had chosen to walk toward it. The forest opened slowly as they descended. The light grew stronger. The smoke of the kingdom rose darker and thicker against the pale sky. She could hear sounds now that had been inaudible from the clearing. The distant sound of voices, the noise of carts on a road, the ordinary chaos of human life moving through its daily pattern. A world beyond the dark trees, a world beyond the fire. Her legs remembered how to move with purpose. Her breathing settled into the rhythm of a journey rather than the rhythm of waiting. With each step south, the pull of the clearing weakened. The weight of 3 years began, imperceptibly, to lift. She did not run. She did not hurry. She simply walked, one foot in front of the other, away from ash and toward smoke. Nessa did not look back again.